The Marilyn Monroe mystery finally solved, and it's not good. Her death was ruled a probable suicide, but Marilyn Monroe's final hours remain shrouded in contradiction. Missing phone records, conflicting witness accounts, and alleged political entanglements hint at something darker. Now, after decades of speculation, the pieces form a picture Hollywood never wanted the world to see. It was just past midnight, August 5, 1962, when the phone rang at the Los Angeles Police Department. What followed would become one of the most infamous calls in Hollywood history. Marilyn Monroe, the most photographed woman on Earth, the blonde bombshell who defined an era, was found dead in her Brentwood home. Naked, face down, holding a telephone, with empty pill bottles nearby and a locked bedroom door. Official cause? Suicide. Barbiturate overdose. Case closed. Except it wasn't. From the very first announcement, the world sensed something wasn't right. The front pages declared, "Marilyn Monroe dies," in bold black letters. But the real story was already slipping into shadow. Why were there inconsistencies in the time of death? Why was her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, washing bedsheets at 4:30 in the morning? Why had Monroe's organs disappeared before a second toxicology could be performed? And why were the LAPD and the press so quick to accept a story that seemed so tragically neat? Even in death, Marilyn was a commodity. Her legacy packaged and sold as a cautionary tale of a beautiful woman who couldn't handle fame. A girl who had everything, they said, but died alone. But behind that myth was something else, something messier, darker, more dangerous. The perfect Hollywood ending didn't match the timeline, the testimony, or the tone of those final days. That week, Marilyn had been preparing for a comeback. Rehired on the set of Something's Got to Give, she had posed nude for Bert Stearns' The Last Sitting photo shoot. She was upbeat, energetic, and unusually focused, calling friends to mend fences and planning future projects. Yet within days, she would be gone. In the hours after her death, key decisions were made that would cloud the case forever. The first officers on the scene reported inconsistencies, but their notes were later revised or suppressed. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, claimed he broke into the room and found her dead, but other witnesses later claimed the body had been moved. The pathologist couldn't find the pills in her stomach. Her phone records were erased, and perhaps most damning, both the FBI and the CIA had files on Monroe, files tied to her romantic connections to President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Those weren't just affairs, they were liabilities. Whispers began immediately that Marilyn knew too much, that she was threatening to go public, that she had recorded phone calls, kept diaries, even mentioned nuclear secrets shared in pillow talk with the president. Whether those claims were paranoid delusions or inconvenient truths, they painted a chilling possibility. What if Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a victim of her own demons, but a casualty of something far more calculated? Some historians dismiss these theories as conspiracy fodder. Others say the cover-up wasn't about murder, but protecting reputations, institutions, and political power. Yet for decades, insiders have broken silence, eyewitnesses have changed stories, and redacted government files have been slowly unsealed. What's emerged isn't a tidy explanation, but a tangled one. One former LAPD officer later admitted there was pressure from people way above us. They wanted it wrapped up, quietly. The night Marilyn Monroe died, the world lost more than a movie star. It lost a symbol of fame, femininity, rebellion, and danger. But the circumstances of her death still hang in the air like fog over the Pacific coast. Eerie, unresolved, and too perfectly staged. A locked room, a silent phone, a star dimmed forever. But the mystery, that was just beginning. Before the diamonds and dresses, before she was the most desired woman in the world, she was just Norma Jean, an unwanted child in a broken city, a girl born not with stars in her eyes, but shadows on her doorstep. June 1st, 1926, Los Angeles, a city dreaming of silver screens and false promises. Into that world came Norma Jean Mortensen, or Baker, depending on the document, her very name uncertain. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was a film cutter at Consolidated Film Industries. Her father? A question mark. Some said he was Charles Stanley Gifford, a co-worker who vanished without a trace. Others speculated on different names, but the man himself never acknowledged the child. The baby's birth certificate would bear no father's name, just one of many blanks that would haunt her life. By the time she was just a toddler, the fractures had already begun. Gladys struggled with mental illness, swinging between lucidity and collapse. When Norma Jean was just 7, Gladys suffered a complete psychotic break and was institutionalized, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The state declared her unfit for motherhood, and with no father, no family to step in, Norma Jean entered the foster system, a cold, impersonal machine that would churn her through a dozen different homes. She was placed with friends of her mother, distant relatives, and at one point even an orphanage. Some homes were kind, others weren't. A house in Compton reportedly beat her for wetting the bed. Another guardian allegedly tried to exploit her. When she later spoke of this period, Monroe described it as one of isolation and constant fear. "I didn't belong to anyone," she said. "I was like a stray." It was in those years, lost between addresses and unfamiliar faces, that Norma Jean began crafting a defense mechanism that would evolve into her most powerful weapon: performance. She learned how to be what people wanted. A good girl, a polite guest, a pretty face. Survival depended on it. She found solace in small things: movies, magazines, mirrors. She watched Jean Harlow, Lana Turner, and Carole Lombard, women who seemed untouchable, invincible. But in the orphanage, when she looked into the mirror, all she saw was a skinny, unwanted girl with crooked teeth and frizzy hair. At age 15, she was living with Grace Goddard, a friend of her mother's, when Grace's husband was transferred out of state. Rather than return her to the orphanage, they arranged a solution common at the time: marriage. Norma Jean was married at age 16 to her 21-year-old neighbor, James Dougherty. It was legal, it was convenient, and it gave her stability on paper. But it wasn't love. It was escape. As America entered World War II, Dougherty enlisted in the Merchant Marine, and Norma Jean took a job at a munitions factory. That mundane assignment would change her life forever. A photographer from the military's PR department snapped her picture for morale posters, and within months, modeling offers started pouring in. A girl no one wanted had become a face everyone desired. It was during this time she dyed her brown hair platinum blonde. The transformation was more than cosmetic. It was an erasure. Norma Jean was shedding her past brick by brick and building the scaffolding for someone new. Marilyn Monroe didn't come from nowhere. The name was forged by the studio, Marilyn after Marilyn Miller and Monroe from her mother's maiden name. But the performance, that was all Norma Jean. She would embody innocence and seduction, confidence and fragility, comedy and tragedy, all at once. Some historians argue that this reinvention was empowering, her way of taking control of a life defined by abandonment. others see it as the ultimate surrender to male fantasy, a girl turning herself into an icon to be consumed. But there's no denying the cost. From the moment she became Marilyn, Norma Jean began to disappear. Still, behind every sultry glance and iconic pose was the girl who had once clung to a doll in an orphanage bunk, the girl who had changed homes like costumes, the girl who never had a father, a stable mother, or a permanent address. That wound, the wound of not being seen for who she truly was, would drive her ambition, fuel her fame, and ultimately contribute to the suspicion that her death was not just a tragedy, but a betrayal. "I just want to be wonderful," she once said.
Long before influencer was a term or brand a buzzword, the Hollywood studio system had already mastered the art of image control. And no one was more managed, more manufactured than Marilyn Monroe. Behind the red lips and breathy voice was an industry machine designed to mold, monetize, and manipulate. Monroe wasn't born a legend, she was built to be one. The question was, at what cost? The 1950s were the golden age of Hollywood, but also its most suffocating. Studios operated like monarchies. Executives like Darryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox wielded power over actors with contractual chains. Marilyn was locked into a deal that paid her far less than her male co-stars, $500 a week when she first signed, and forced her into films she neither believed in nor wanted. She had no say in scripts, wardrobe, or public appearances. Refusal was met with suspension or smear campaigns. She was marketed as a fantasy, not a woman, but a product. Fox press agents wrote copy for her interviews. Stylists dictated how she dressed off set. Photographers were given orders to shoot her in soft focus, head slightly tilted, lips always parted. Every studio calendar, press photo, and red carpet moment was calibrated to reinforce a single message. Marilyn Monroe equals sex appeal. And audiences bought it. The dumb blonde, the flirt, the girl who didn't know how smart or tragic she really was. But behind the smiles, Monroe was increasingly suffocating under the demands of this curated identity. Privately, she struggled with stuttering, stage fright, and a paralyzing fear of rejection. Her friends, like acting coach Paula Strasberg, described her as deeply sensitive and intellectually curious, a voracious reader of psychology, philosophy, and Russian literature. But the studio press kits didn't mention Dostoevsky. They stuck with champagne and mink. Even Monroe's love life became a marketing tool. Her marriage to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio was presented as the perfect union of sports and stardom. In reality, it was a war zone of conflicting values. DiMaggio was intensely jealous, controlling, and furious over the infamous 7-year itch subway grate scene, so much so that he allegedly struck her during an argument about it. 9 months after their wedding, she filed for divorce. Her third marriage to playwright Arthur Miller in 1956 was supposed to be different. Here was a man of letters, a Pulitzer winner, someone who respected her mind. But even that love story at its height couldn't save her from the pressures of being America's most watched woman. Miller would later write that he felt he had married someone doomed, calling her a person looking for rescue, but from a thing unnamed. The truth was, Marilyn had been trying to rescue herself, and the industry didn't like that. Her efforts to grow as an actress were often mocked by male critics and executives alike. One columnist wrote, "Marilyn is like a beautiful vase who insists on being taken seriously for its handle." When she pushed for better roles, like in The Misfits, 1961, the press accused her of being difficult. If she was late to set, it was because she was spiraling. If she cried during a scene, it was instability, not method acting. In fact, Marilyn suffered from endometriosis, a painful condition that severely impacted her ability to work, sleep, or carry pregnancies. She self-medicated with barbiturates and amphetamines, often prescribed to her in dangerous combinations by multiple doctors who never coordinated care. The more she struggled, the more the studio leaned in, not to help, but to exploit. Behind the camera, a darker side of the industry loomed. Studio bosses traded access to actresses like currency. Marilyn herself once admitted, "I slept with producers. I'd be a liar if I said I didn't." Some stories hinted at coercion. Others suggested she used sex as survival. Either way, the power imbalance was clear and toxic. Even more disturbingly, it's been alleged that intelligence agencies began taking notice of her rising influence. Her relationships with Arthur Miller, who was investigated by the FBI during the Red Scare, and later with President John F. Kennedy, were not just tabloid fodder, but they were potential national security concerns. Files on Marilyn Monroe existed in both FBI and CIA archives. Her home was likely bugged, her phone tapped. She had become not just a star, but a liability. And she knew it. She once said to a confidant, "If I'm going to be a symbol, I'd rather be a symbol of sex than a symbol of nothing." But as the walls closed in, even that symbol started to feel like a prison. The system that made her famous also trapped her in amber. To the men in charge, she was most valuable as a fantasy frozen in time, forever young, forever blonde, forever silent. But Marilyn wasn't silent. Not in her diaries, not in her conversations with close friends, and not in the whispered warnings she gave in her final weeks. She had begun to speak, to push back, to tell the truth about what had been done to her and what she knew. And that, some believe, is when she became truly dangerous. In a world that preferred her silent and smiling, Marilyn Monroe's intellect was perhaps her most subversive trait. While studios banked on her curves and coquettish gaze, Marilyn was slowly, carefully crafting something deeper. A self-education, a political curiosity, and an artistic hunger that the blonde bombshell mask could no longer contain. She wasn't just a movie star. She was a woman wrestling for control over her mind, her art, and her legacy. From the outside, she remained the ultimate Hollywood fantasy. But behind closed doors, Marilyn surrounded herself with poets, playwrights, and revolutionaries. She was often seen reading James Joyce, Freud, Dostoevsky, and Proust. She subscribed to intellectual journals, annotated her books in the margins, and questioned the cultural power structures that governed her life. One friend noted, "She read more than anyone I knew in the actor's studio. She didn't read gossip columns. She read Tolstoy." The public didn't know this side of her. Studios feared it. Reporters ignored it. But Marilyn's notebooks, later discovered after her death, revealed a woman deeply introspective and philosophical. "I want to be a great actress," she wrote. "I know it's going to take time and maybe years, but I'll be the best if I can be." In another passage, "I am trying to find myself. Sometimes that's not easy." She studied with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York and formed close bonds with other method actors, Brandon Brando, Montgomery Clift, Shelley Winters. Strasberg considered her one of the most naturally gifted actors she's ever worked with, despite Hollywood's dismissal of her as a mere sex symbol. She took her role seriously. She agonized over performance. She wasn't trying to escape her image, she was trying to outgrow it. But her insistence on being more, on being taken seriously, came with consequences. Her studio, 20th Century Fox, grew uneasy with her independent production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. They had always controlled her, right down to her lipstick shade and dress length. Now she was dictating terms, demanding creative input, even walking off set when scripts didn't meet her standards. She clashed with directors, rejected studio fluff, and took increasingly dramatic, layered roles, like Rosalind in The Misfits, 1961, a haunting performance that many now see as her most autobiographical. That film, written by her then-husband Arthur Miller, was supposed to be their shared masterpiece. Instead, it marked the unraveling of their marriage. Marilyn was physically fragile during filming, dependent on barbiturates and amphetamines, but emotionally resolute. She wanted the part to matter. She wanted the pain to show. She delivered what some critics called a shattering portrayal and what others at the time shrugged off as melancholy vanity. Privately, Monroe was growing bolder. Her reading list shifted from novels to political essays. She developed friendships with progressive thinkers and activists. She began asking dangerous questions about power, gender, and government. According to declassified FBI documents, Marilyn's circle had begun to include members of leftist organizations, especially through Arthur Miller, who was still blacklisted in some political circles for refusing to name names during the McCarthy hearings. In 1960, Monroe openly supported the Democratic campaign and became a vocal fan of John F. Kennedy. Their first meeting was electric, as friends recall. Within a year, she would be entangled in a covert affair with the President of the United States.
and shortly after, with his brother Robert. To some, these affairs were scandalous gossip. To others, they marked the moment Monroe crossed an invisible line, from celebrity to liability. The Kennedys represented American power at its zenith. Their relationship with Monroe wasn't just romantic, it was risky. Her calls were monitored, her homes likely bugged. Monroe, always prone to pouring her thoughts into diaries and tape recorders, began making notes about things she'd heard during pillow talk. Some friends claimed that she knew about Cuban affairs, atomic secrets, and even mafia connections, all casually dropped by men who didn't believe she was smart enough to understand. But she did. One of her last house guests, actor Peter Lawford, would later claim that Monroe was becoming too talkative, that she felt used, that she was threatening to hold a press conference. Whether this was true or a dramatization by Lawford under pressure, it adds to the growing sense that Monroe's knowledge, her access, was no longer a private indulgence for the rich and powerful. It was a liability. Just weeks before her death, she was reportedly warned to stay silent. She was dropped by the Kennedys. Calls went unanswered. Doors that were once open slammed shut. Monroe, always vulnerable to abandonment, reportedly became erratic and emotional. But she was also defiant. She was done being quiet, said one confidant. She had been used by too many men for too long. Some historians argue that Monroe's unraveling in her final weeks was the result of heartbreak and addiction. Others suggest that the pressure surrounding her, from political affairs to studio retaliation, created a paranoia that may have been entirely justified. She had spent her life building an image. And now as that image began to crack, so too did the walls of silence she had carefully maintained. "I'm not a toy," she once told a journalist.
To understand the last hours of Marilyn Monroe, one must reckon with the gravitational pull of the Kennedy brothers, men who ruled not just politics, but the American imagination. To the world, they were the princes of Camelot. To Marilyn, they were more than lovers. They were her undoing. By mid-1962, Monroe's emotional entanglement with both President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had become the talk of two very different circles, the Hollywood elite and federal intelligence. Each had its own reasons to panic. She first met JFK through Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law and a Rat Pack regular. Their initial rendezvous, cloaked in cocktail chatter and Cold War flirtation, was, by all accounts, instant chemistry. She called him Jack, he called her Kid. But Monroe's fascination was more than romantic. She was drawn to his aura of control, of intellect, of historic consequence. She once told a friend, "With him, I feel I'm part of something real, something that matters." But JFK didn't feel the same. To him, Marilyn was a beautiful risk, a diversion with high stakes. Secret Service agents grew nervous. So did the administration. Monroe was unpredictable, prone to mood swings, addicted to pills. And worse, she had a habit of talking too much. Her presence at Democratic fundraisers began raising eyebrows. Intelligence agencies allegedly kept tabs on her calls, her travels, and her increasingly volatile statements. Rumors began circulating that she was not only threatening to go public with her Kennedy relationships, but also about the conversations they had in private: Cuba, Castro, the Bay of Pigs, even nuclear weapon stockpiles. No one could prove she intended to leak national secrets, but no one could guarantee she wouldn't. Then, suddenly, Jack was gone. From her life, at least. The calls stopped, invitations dried up, Peter Lawford distanced himself. Whether due to political pressure or marital protection, JFK erased her without explanation. Monroe, spiraling from heartbreak and humiliation, turned her attention to his brother. Robert Kennedy's relationship with Monroe remains more elusive. Some witnesses insist it was a full-blown affair. Others say he was sent merely to handle her. Regardless of his intent, RFK found himself drawn into her emotional orbit. Eyewitnesses recall him visiting her Brentwood home multiple times in July and early August of 1962. On at least one of those visits, he was not alone, reportedly accompanied by LAPD officers sympathetic to the Kennedys. Whether it was romance or damage control, their final meeting was anything but tender. On August 4th, the day of Marilyn's death,
Several reports place Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. Official records say he was in San Francisco, but multiple sources, including ambulance driver James Hall and handyman Norman Jeffries, later claimed to have seen Kennedy at Monroe's residence that day, accompanied by Lawford and two unknown men. What happened inside that house remains the subject of fierce speculation. Some believe RFK came to retrieve her infamous Red Diary, or audio tapes that allegedly documented private conversations. Others suggest he came to calm her or threaten her into silence. What is known is that Marilyn's behavior in those final days was erratic. She had reportedly called a press conference for the following Monday, something her agent denied but her friends insist was in the works. Why? To clear the air, she said. To some, that was code for public revenge. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, later told a BBC interviewer, before quickly retracting, that Bobby was there the night Marilyn died. Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, remained tight-lipped for years, but colleagues reported he was deeply disturbed after Marilyn's death, convinced, they said, that powerful men had been involved. If the Kennedy team was present on August 4th, the implications are staggering. And yet, no investigation followed, no subpoenas, no grand jury. Within hours of her death, the official line was settled. Overdose. Accidental. Tragic. Case closed. But the signs of a cover-up multiplied quickly. Phone records from her home disappeared. The coroner's report was vague, her organs were removed, and a second toxicology was never conducted. The LAPD failed to photograph the death scene properly. Witness statements conflicted, changed, or were never taken at all. And Robert Kennedy? He vanished from the narrative entirely. His name was not mentioned in any official reports. When journalists pressed the issue, they were brushed off. When books hinted at his involvement, legal threats followed. Some historians still defend the official story. They point to Marilyn's history of overdoses, mental health struggles, and reliance on barbiturates as the true cause of death. And yes, her emotional state was fragile, but many argue that fragility doesn't explain the missing time, the inconsistent autopsy, or the rapid erasure of her political connections. And then there's the timeline. Dr. Greenson claimed to find her body at 3:30 a.m., but ambulance drivers say they were called much earlier, around 10:30 p.m. When pressed, Murray and Greenson adjusted their stories. And key witnesses, like Marilyn's press agent, her publicist Arthur Jacobs, claimed to be on the scene before her body was even found, raising more questions than answers. Theories abound that RFK and associates were at the house earlier, confronted Marilyn, and she either died during an altercation or was sedated to silence her permanently, that her body was moved, that the scene was staged, that the press conference, scheduled to out the Kennedys, was stopped before it could begin? No definitive proof has surfaced, but too many threads point to the same knot. Monroe was about to speak, and someone had the motive, means, and momentum to make sure she never did. Whether her death was a political accident, a criminal operation, or a tragic cover-up remains unsolved. But for many, the Kennedy connection is no longer rumor. It's the key to the entire mystery. One thing is certain. After August 4th, 1962, the Kennedys never publicly acknowledged Marilyn Monroe again. Not her life, not her death, not even her name. She was buried with roses from Joe DiMaggio. Not a word from Camelot. On July 31, 1962, just 5 days before her death, Marilyn Monroe sat down for what would become her final interview. The session was conducted by Life magazine journalist Richard Merriman in her modest Brentwood home. It was supposed to mark a rebirth. Instead, it became a coded farewell.
The Monroe Merriman met that day wasn't the fragile wreck the public had come to expect. She was sharp, perceptive, and eager to challenge the myths that had encased her. "Please don't make me a joke," she told him early in the interview. In the interview with what I believe. That belief that she had been used, misunderstood, and now, finally, was beginning to find her voice. She spoke about her childhood, her marriages, and the suffocating image imposed on her by Hollywood. But what caught Merriman off guard was the way she talked about power. Not just fame or beauty, but power. How it worked, how it shifted, and how it had always been denied her. "I was never used to being happy," she said, "so that wasn't something I ever took for granted." In the days that followed, Monroe made a flurry of phone calls, to friends, to colleagues, to her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio. She reportedly reconciled with key figures from her past, including studio heads who had once branded her difficult. She was excited about restarting Something's Gotta Give and taking on new, more serious roles. She even talked about wanting children again, something her body had long denied her. But those close to her saw something else beneath the surface: urgency. Actor Steve Allen said she seemed on the edge, a woman desperately trying to close the loop on her life. Her final taped interview would become famous for its contradictions. One moment Monroe sounded hopeful, the next, haunted. She said she wanted to be known for being real, but admitted that she sometimes felt not real at all. In what many now interpret as a veiled threat, Monroe said, "The public doesn't know what goes on behind the scenes. People think because you're public, they know everything. But they don't, not even close." Shortly after the interview, Monroe placed a call to journalist Dorothy Kilgallen, known for her fearless exposés and political scoops. According to Kilgallen's notes, Monroe hinted at plans to go public with a story that would shock the country. She never got the chance. Just days later, she was gone. The timing was chilling. On August 3rd, the day before her death, Monroe met with her publicist Arthur Jacobs to finalize what she called the biggest move of my career. Jacobs later told reporters he believed she meant going public with her story, not just about Hollywood, but about her political entanglements. He declined to elaborate further, but years later he admitted she was playing with fire. And everyone knew it. The press, sensing something larger at play, began asking questions almost immediately. Why were there so many high-profile visitors to her home in the final days? Why was Peter Lawford reportedly panicked the night of her death, making desperate calls to the Kennedy estate? Why did Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, change her story several times, initially saying the bedroom door was locked, then later admitting it wasn't? Why wait? By the time the police were finally called, the scene had already been disturbed. Her room had been tidied, her bedside table rearranged. Several pill bottles had been straightened into neat rows. Her body was laid out face down, holding the telephone, as though caught in the act of calling for help. It looked too perfect, too staged. Coroner Dr. Thomas Noguchi later admitted that there were serious inconsistencies in the toxicology. Her blood showed lethal levels of Nembutal and chloral hydrate, but no residue was found in her stomach. If she had taken the drugs orally, as the suicide theory insisted, some trace would have remained. The alternative theories? She may have been injected or given an enema laced with sedatives, something not unheard of in Hollywood at the time, but no tests were performed to confirm or rule out either method. Even stranger, Monroe's vital organs, specifically her stomach, liver, and intestines, were removed and, without explanation, destroyed before independent toxicologists could examine them. Lab technician Lionel Grandison, responsible for filing the report, later claimed he had never even seen the body and that someone else filled in the death certificate. He also stated that a red diary, believed to contain Monroe's personal thoughts and political secrets, was in the evidence file until it mysteriously vanished. That diary has never been found. Some within the coroner's office, including Noguchi himself, grew suspicious. In interviews decades later, Noguchi would dance around accusations,
often saying he was not allowed to pursue deeper forensic angles. He stopped short of declaring murder, but his language became increasingly evasive over the years. There were many things that didn't make sense, he told biographer Anthony Summers, but we were under pressure. The city was watching. Pressure? From whom? And why? The most plausible source was political, with Robert Kennedy rumored to have visited Monroe that day. Any thorough investigation into her death would have demanded an inquiry into his whereabouts, motives, and associates. That would mean subpoenaing a sitting Attorney General of the United States. That would mean implicating the Kennedy family in what could, at the minimum, be classified as manslaughter or worse. So instead, the conclusion was vague. Probable suicide. Not certain, not verified, just probable. Even the wording of the coroner's report seemed curiously non-committal. It read, "No evidence of foul play," but that's different from saying foul play didn't occur. The term leaves a sliver of doubt, a crack just wide enough for skepticism to grow. And it did. In the following weeks, the LAPD came under scrutiny for their handling of the scene. They failed to preserve key evidence. No fingerprint dusting was conducted on the pill bottles. Her room had already been tidied. The sheets had been washed. Her phone records for the previous 48 hours were missing. Her housekeeper gave conflicting accounts. Her psychiatrist made statements that shifted with each retelling. Meanwhile, press access was curiously well orchestrated. Photos of the death scene were carefully selected and distributed. Early leaks supported the suicide narrative, but some journalists, including Dorothy Kilgallen and Frank Capel, pushed back. Kilgallen publicly questioned the timeline and mentioned rumors about Bobby Kennedy's presence. Months later, she would be dead under suspicious circumstances herself. Capel, a right-wing writer with political motives, also published damning claims. Though some of his conclusions were extreme, his records of phone logs, Kennedy travel patterns, and Monroe's increasingly paranoid behavior were verified by others over time. His 1964 pamphlet, The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe, was among the first to suggest that the cover-up was a coordinated act of political containment. The censorship extended beyond media. Studios issued gag orders on employees. Friends were warned not to speak. Several key figures, like press agent Arthur Jacobs and actor Peter Lawford, refused to give sworn testimony or altered stories in later interviews. Lawford, haunted by guilt, allegedly confessed to friends on his deathbed that the Kennedys were involved and that we all just cleaned it up. Perhaps most telling of all was how quickly the death was declared resolved. No grand jury was convened, no federal investigation pursued. By August 17th, Life magazine had published its sanitized posthumous interview, and Marilyn's death was etched in cultural memory as the tragic end of a troubled starlet. But the files told a different story. Years later, under pressure from journalists and public records lawsuits, the FBI released over 300 pages of documents related to Marilyn Monroe. They revealed surveillance, recorded conversations, and concerns about her political leanings. One memo referred to her association with persons whose loyalty is suspect. Another more chilling entry simply stated, "Subject may possess sensitive information related to nuclear testing and international affairs." Why would an actress be in possession of such knowledge? Because she had been in the room with the men who carried those secrets. Whether by accident or pillow talk, Monroe had acquired more than most civilians were ever meant to know, and in the final days of her life, she was preparing to tell it. The autopsy didn't solve the mystery, it only made it worse. It showed that she had died, not how, and certainly not why. It left a crater where clarity should have been, and into that void poured decades of doubt. A legend had died, but the lies had only just begun.
As the official story hardened and the headlines faded, the people closest to Marilyn Monroe began to disappear, literally and figuratively. Some walked away quietly, others changed their stories, and a few met suspicious ends of their own. The truth didn't vanish overnight. It eroded, person by person, memory by memory. all while the public was fed a legend polished into perfection. The most enigmatic of these figures was Dr. Ralph Greenson, Monroe's psychiatrist. A prominent Los Angeles psychoanalyst, Greenson had been treating Monroe for over a year by the time she died. He claimed to love her like a daughter, and in some ways, he seemed to act more like a guardian than a doctor. He visited her daily, chose her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, called friends on her behalf, even allegedly stopped her from attending events with men he deemed dangerous. To some, his concern seemed noble, to others, controlling. On the night of August 4, Greenson claimed he was the one who broke the glass to reach Monroe's locked room, where he found her lifeless, face down, still holding the telephone. But this account quickly fell apart. The window showed no signs of being shattered. The body appeared posed, and when asked to explain how she ingested such a massive amount of barbiturates with no residue in her stomach, Greenson had no answer. Decades later, whispers emerged that Greenson had become deeply conflicted, that he may have been involved in sedating Monroe to calm her, but that the dosage, whether intentional or not, had gone too far. Some speculated he was coerced into silence by outside forces, particularly if Robert Kennedy was indeed at the home that evening. The psychiatrist's notes for that weekend are missing. Greenson never spoke publicly about the contradictions. He died in 1979, taking the weight of those secrets with him. Then there was Eunice Murray. Monroe's housekeeper was the last person to see her alive. She gave the police a strange, stuttering statement. She noticed the bedroom light was on late, that she grew worried and called Greenson. But in later interviews, Murray contradicted herself. On British television in 1985, she slipped. "Why, at my age, do I still have to cover this thing up? It was the Kennedys. Of course it was." The interview was quickly cut short. Murray, too, passed away in the 1990s, her statements muddled by years of retraction and revision. Some believed she had been protecting her employer. Others claimed she was paid to keep quiet. Peter Lawford's role remains one of the most suspicious. A member of the Rat Pack and brother-in-law to both Kennedys, Lawford was allegedly Monroe's link to both men. He introduced her to JFK and reportedly arranged multiple secret meetups with Robert. On the night of her death, Lawford claimed he spoke to Monroe on the phone and became concerned, but did nothing. In private, however, Lawford told a different story. Multiple sources, including fellow actor Gianni Russo, claimed that in his final years, Lawford was racked with guilt. One friend recalled him drunkenly confessing, "We didn't mean for it to happen, but she wouldn't shut up." He died in 1984 of liver failure, leaving no formal statement behind but countless rumors in his wake. Publicist Arthur Jacobs presented another puzzle. Official timelines suggest Monroe's body was discovered by Greenson around 3:30 a.m., but Jacobs later told friends he was at her house before midnight, before the body was officially found. How could that be? Who called him? Why was a press agent present at what should have been a medical emergency? Some theorize Jacobs was called early by someone involved in the incident, perhaps to begin shaping the story for the media before police arrived. His early access remains unexplained. He too passed away without offering clarity. Even the LAPD officer first on the scene, Sergeant Jack Clemens, later admitted that something felt wrong. He said the behavior of Greenson and Murray was too rehearsed. The house seemed staged, the sheets were clean, the pill bottles arranged. They were acting, he said, like people playing a part. Clemens spent years speaking out, believing the official version of Monroe's death was a lie, but his suspicions were never acted upon. Then came the silence. Those who tried to speak out, like columnist Dorothy Killigan, met tragic ends.
Killigan had publicly challenged the Kennedy narrative and claimed to have explosive information about Monroe's final hours. In 1965, she was found dead in her New York townhouse, officially barbiturate overdose. Sound familiar? Her notes, drafts, and interview tapes vanished from her home. Even Hollywood friends who wanted to help were pushed to the margins. Actress Shelley Winters, a longtime confidant, said she always suspected Monroe had been given something against her will. Monroe wasn't suicidal that weekend. She was pissed off. She was ready to take on the world. Joe DiMaggio never wavered in his belief that Monroe had been silenced. He refused to allow Hollywood celebrities, politicians, or members of the Kennedy family to attend her funeral. He never spoke to Peter Lawford again. For 20 years after her death, he had roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week. He lived the rest of his life in quiet grief. Years later, private investigator Milo Spirigio and author Robert Slatzer reignited public interest in the mystery. Slatzer claimed to have been secretly married to Monroe for 3 days, a story widely disputed, but he was among the first to publish detailed allegations of political foul play. Spirigio compiled witness accounts, FBI documents, and conflicting statements into an alternative theory of Monroe's death. Though often dismissed as conspiracy theorists, their investigations uncovered enough raw material to challenge the official narrative: Kennedy connections, FBI surveillance, toxicology inconsistencies, and testimony from those who were suddenly unwilling or unable to keep talking. Some historians argue the mystery has endured precisely because no one person knew everything. Each figure had a fragment, but collectively, they painted a mosaic of manipulation, censorship, and something Monroe herself feared most: being erased by the very people who claimed to love her. Her death wasn't simply the end of a life. It was the closing of many mouths. As the years passed, the mystery of Marilyn Monroe's death faded from front-page headlines, but not from the minds of those who understood its deeper implications. Beyond the tragedy of a lost icon lay an even more unsettling possibility: that her death wasn't merely Hollywood's darkest secret, but Washington's too. In 1962, America stood on the brink of calamity. The Cold War was reaching a boil. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just months away. Civil rights protests shook the South. Trust in institutions was already beginning to fracture, and the Kennedys, perched atop a fragile political dynasty, were doing everything they could to project strength and control. And then there was Marilyn, an actress, a mistress, a liability. To some in the intelligence community, she wasn't just a fading celebrity, she was a risk vector, a person with the proximity to access sensitive information and the instability to expose it. When she began talking about holding a press conference in the final days of her life, those closest to the levers of power began to panic. This wasn't speculation. Declassified FBI and CIA documents prove that Monroe had been monitored for years, long before her death. J. Edgar Hoover himself signed off on surveillance operations involving her connections to communist sympathizers, especially during her marriage to Arthur Miller. Files from the Bureau labeled her a security concern due to her growing relationships with left-leaning intellectuals and her suspected sympathies towards causes like civil rights and nuclear disarmament. In one memo dated August 3, 1962, a mere day before her death, the CIA flagged Monroe's rumored association with Cuban diplomats in Mexico and discussions related to nuclear testing in the Nevada desert. The report also mentioned her alleged diary, which may contain references to discussions with high-ranking federal officials. That diary, of course, was never found. More curious still was how quickly these files were buried after her death.
Shortly after Monroe's body was discovered, several federal agencies, including the FBI and CIA, began quietly scrubbing or reclassifying related documents. Phone logs were seized, surveillance tapes vanished, informants were silenced. Hoover, notorious for maintaining dossiers on the private lives of public figures, never spoke about Monroe's case publicly, but privately he issued orders to keep anything politically damaging from surfacing. Why? The most common theory is containment.
By the late 20th century, Marilyn Monroe had become more than a woman. She was myth. Frozen forever at 36, her smile still adorned posters, her whispery voice echoed in pop culture, and her face symbolized an era of glamour and vulnerability. But behind that iconography lay the paper trail. Files, logs, and records that once held the truth. And over the decades, those files began to vanish. Some disappeared quietly, others were erased with legal precision, and a few never surfaced at all, leading investigators and historians to wonder, was this destruction accidental or deliberate? One of the most significant losses was Marilyn's so-called Red Diary. Long rumored to exist, this personal journal allegedly contained details about her relationships with President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, as well as sensitive conversations she'd overheard. Friends claimed she wrote about Cuba, nuclear secrets, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and her growing fear that they were listening to her. The diary was seen by multiple witnesses, including housekeeper Eunice Murray and acting coach Lee Strasberg. Yet when her estate was probated, it was gone. Not misplaced, missing, like it had never existed. Some claim it was removed the night she died, either by the Kennedy's men or by intelligence operatives. Others believe it was buried in a vault to this day, perhaps held by a federal agency with no intention of ever releasing it. Then there were the phone records. In the days before her death, Monroe made dozens of calls to friends, to doctors, to journalists, but none of those calls appeared in the official police file. Her phone company records for that weekend vanished entirely. The LAPD could never explain the gap, a simple clerical error or a strategic erasure. One record that did survive came from Peter Lawford's home, showing multiple calls to Monroe's number the night of August 4. Lawford later claimed she answered but was incoherent, then stopped speaking mid-call. That would place her alive at 7:30 p.m., but if she truly died after midnight, why was her phone found off the hook in her hand as if she'd been trying to call for help? The timeline doesn't add up, and the files that could have clarified it, destroyed. The LAPD also lost several internal memos relating to the case. According to former detective Jack Clemens, officers were told to stand down. It came from the top, he said. We were told, don't dig. Let it go. Clemens was eventually pushed out of the department. Even Monroe's autopsy suffered mysterious revisions. Dr. Thomas Noguchi originally recorded that Monroe had bruising on her lower back and the back of her legs, injuries not consistent with someone lying still in bed for hours. But those notations were later removed or reworded in the final report. Noguchi would later say that pressures from above influenced how the report was finalized. When the DA reopened the case in 1982, multiple files were requested from federal archives, yet what came back was a joke. Pages upon pages of blacked-out documents. Some files were sealed, others had been shredded. One CIA report dated August 6, 1962, was entirely redacted except for the words, "Information unavailable." Unavailable. Convenient. FBI records tell a similar story. Hoover had opened files on Monroe in the early 1950s due to her marriage to Arthur Miller and suspected communist sympathies. These files were later expanded to include her connections with Sinatra, the Kennedys, and Cuban diplomats. Yet when journalists filed Freedom of Information requests in the 1990s, more than half the pages were missing, and others had entire paragraphs redacted. What were they hiding? One heavily redacted entry mentions a high-level concern that Monroe would embarrass the office of the presidency and references containment discussions. The implication is chilling, that Monroe's death was not a personal tragedy, but a national security incident. By the early 2000s, documentarians, biographers, and former investigators all reached the same grim conclusion. The historical record had been gutted. Whatever Monroe had written, said, or recorded in those final days, someone had worked very hard to erase it. But not everyone stayed silent. Former CIA operative Norman Hodges made headlines in the 2010s when, from his deathbed, he claimed the agency had been involved in Monroe's death on orders to protect state secrets. While his confession remains unverified, it added fuel to a fire that never fully went out. Then there were the independent archivists and whistleblowers, people like Anthony Summers, Milo Spirilio, and Donald Wolfe, who spent decades assembling witness statements, leaked documents, and physical inconsistencies into an unofficial archive of their own. What they found wasn't definitive, but damning. There were too many missing pieces for Monroe's death to be what the public was told. Her diary? Gone. Her organs? Destroyed. Phone logs? Vanished. Autopsy notes? Altered. Witnesses? Dead, silenced, or recanted. Federal documents? Redacted to the point of absurdity. What were they hiding? One heavily redacted entry mentions a high-level concern that Monroe would embarrass the office of the presidency and references containment discussions. The implication is chilling, that Monroe's death was not a personal tragedy, but a national security incident. By the early 2000s, documentarians, biographers, and former investigators all reached the same grim conclusion. The historical record had been gutted. Whatever Monroe had written, said, or recorded in those final days, someone had worked very hard to erase it. But not everyone stayed silent. Former CIA operative Norman Hodges made headlines in the 2010s when, from his deathbed, he claimed the agency had been involved in Monroe's death on orders to protect state secrets. While his confession remains unverified, it added fuel to a fire that never fully went out. Then there were the independent archivists and whistleblowers, people like Anthony Summers, Milo Spirilio, and Donald Wolfe, who spent decades assembling witness statements, leaked documents, and physical inconsistencies into an unofficial archive of their own. What they found wasn't definitive, but damning. There were too many missing pieces for Monroe's death to be what the public was told. Her diary? Gone. Her organs? Destroyed. Phone logs? Vanished. Autopsy notes? Altered. Witnesses? Dead, silenced, or recanted. Federal documents? Redacted to the point of absurdity. What were they hiding? One heavily redacted entry mentions a high-level concern that Monroe would embarrass the office of the presidency and references containment discussions. The implication is chilling, that Monroe's death was not a personal tragedy, but a national security incident. By the early 2000s, documentarians, biographers, and former investigators all reached the same grim conclusion. The historical record had been gutted. Whatever Monroe had written, said, or recorded in those final days, someone had worked very hard to erase it. But not everyone stayed silent. Former CIA operative Norman Hodges made headlines in the 2010s when, from his deathbed, he claimed the agency had been involved in Monroe's death on orders to protect state secrets. While his confession remains unverified, it added fuel to a fire that never fully went out.
Then there were the independent archivists and whistleblowers, people like Anthony Summers, Milo Spirilio, and Donald Wolfe, who spent decades assembling witness statements, leaked documents, and physical inconsistencies into an unofficial archive of their own. What they found wasn't definitive, but damning. There were too many missing pieces for Monroe's death to be what the public was told. Her diary? Gone. Her organs destroyed. Phone logs? Vanished. Autopsy notes? Altered. Witnesses? Dead, silenced, or recanted. Federal documents? Redacted to the point of absurdity. What were they hiding? One heavily redacted entry mentions a high-level concern that Monroe would embarrass the office of the presidency and references containment discussions. The implication is chilling, that Monroe's death was not a personal tragedy, but a national security incident. By the early 2000s, documentarians, biographers, and former investigators all reached the same grim conclusion. The historical record had been gutted. Whatever Monroe had written, said, or recorded in those final days, someone had worked very hard to erase it. But not everyone stayed silent. Former CIA operative Norman Hodges made headlines in the 2010s when